Did you ever wonder how all of those beautiful car liveries driving around in iRacing are being made? In today's video, I'm gonna show you all the necessary steps it takes to go from this to this. I'll show you how to build your own custom livery completely from scratch, and that doesn't only include changing the colors of your car, but also the materials, so you could make everything like a perfect Mercedes silver, a soft glossy coating, completely matte surfaces, custom logos on your car, and so much more. So let's jump right into the action and get started. First of all, you need an image editing software that supports layers, which is also able to make selections and which is able to open up PSD files, because the template that is provided by iRacing is always going to be a PSD file. For the ones of you who don't know what that is, it's basically just a Photoshop document. Luckily, you don't necessarily need to have an active subscription for Adobe Photoshop, since there are alternatives that will get the job done just as well. If you're looking for an image editing software that fulfills all those needs without costing a dime, GIMP is going to be your tool of choice. For this video, I'm going to be using Affinity Photo, which is available as a one-time purchase, which actually comes in handy to iRacing players since we're already spending all of our money for the game and all of its content, right? No matter which of the three you're going to be using, the principle is the same for every single one of them. Only the buttons and maybe the names of the tools we're going to be using are different. I'll put links down in the description for you guys so you can check the software out. So the first thing we'll do is open up the iRacing UI and head over to the paint menu on the left side of the UI. In here we can pick any car we'd like to paint from the list, as you already might know, and in my case I'm gonna pick the brand new McLaren GT3 car, so I can recycle this video while making a new paint for it. By clicking on the download template button in the upper right corner, you'll get the PSD file for your car of choice. So we'll open it up in our software, and the first thing to do here is to get rid of the custom Spec Map folder, since we're gonna create our own in here. To keep things organized, I'm gonna create an empty layer right in between the turn off before exporting TGA and the paintable area folder. In order not to get lost here, I'm gonna create a new folder and drag this layer right into it. This folder gets renamed Paint, so I know where my painted layers are. You don't necessarily have to do these steps, but I've established this workflow for me personally, so everything's tidy and clean for every single car. And just for getting the colors that I'm using for most of my cars, I'm gonna paste my banner in here so I can pick the colors quickly. In order to apply the base color, I could just flood the whole layer with my selected primary color, but instead, for demonstration purposes, I'm gonna be using the brush tool with a very hard edge and paint the color on here so you guys can see what's actually happening. Okay, to get a little bit of inspiration and to also have aid in finding shapes that suit the car well, I'm often examining the already existing color schemes in iRacing's paint menu. Oftentimes there are single shapes that I prefer either for the hood, the roof, or whichever part of the car. In this case, I'm really digging number 15 for the back and the roof of the McLaren, while I'd much prefer to have a separate color and material for the hood, as in number 16. And fortunately, we can pick all of these areas easily in our work file, since this one includes all of the preset schemes as well. We just have to open up the folder Paintable Area and scroll down to the Car Patterns folder, which includes all of them. For whatever reason, the numbering is always off by one digit, so 15 and 16 are going to be 14 and 15 in the file. With the layer selected from whichever we'd like to select the shape, I'm using the Flood Select tool. In Photoshop it's called Magic Wand, in GIMP it's the Fuzzy Select tool, whatever. The only thing I gotta make sure is to turn off the contiguous mode, so it doesn't only select a single area of green, but all of them. And now I just gotta click on the color that I'd like to select, which is gonna be green, return back to my paint folder and create a new layer where we're gonna be painting our secondary color. So I'll pick a bright color from my palette and just draw this right on top here. Following these steps, it's going to be actually really easy to quickly add multiple elements onto your car. I do recommend to keep each single color on one single layer. This is going to be crucial when creating the spec map later on, since we're going to make our selections based on our individual colors by simply selecting the whole layer's content. I'll get to that in a sec, but let's first check out how the paint looks in iRacing so far. In order to do so, we have to save the file in a very specific folder, which is located under Documents, iRacing, Paint. In here, you'll have to find the car you're painting by its name. In this case, it's the folder named McLaren 720S GT3. There is just one very mandatory thing here. The cars folder will only show up if you previously have had a session running with this car before. Otherwise, it's not going to appear in here. So if you've just downloaded your brand new purchase, make sure to start a test session before attempting to save your paint job. And I guess talking about one very mandatory thing wasn't actually right. There's two more things you need to make sure. First, you'll have to save, or let's say rather export the file as a TGA file. And second, you have to follow a given naming pattern, which includes your iRacing ID. You can find your ID by clicking on the helmet in the top right corner and by clicking on Account. It'll display on the top bar and you can also conveniently copy it from there. Once you've got your ID, you can now save the file by naming it car_your ID number. Heading back to the iRacing Paint menu, we can now activate the Show Custom Paint button and voila, here's our very first iteration of our paint job. Returning to our image editor, I'm now going to switch to car pattern 15, which is number 16 in our iRacing Paint menu, since this was the one where the hood is separated. This time, I gotta make sure to turn on the contiguous mode when using the flood select tool, so only this one patch of green is gonna be selected. Once I've got my selection ready, I'm heading back up in my paint folder and I'm gonna create a new layer, since this time I want to paint with a medium greenish color, and I also want to keep this separated so I can use a different material in the spec map as well. While drawing the new color in here, I can see that there's still a little patch of the brighter color underneath it, but I can easily get rid of it using the erase tool on the layer that I've created previously. After exporting and rechecking my color map in iRacing, we can see that the hood looks good now, but the inside of it is still bright green, since this part of the model is located somewhere else on the UV map. It's actually pretty easy to get lost in the 2D document trying to assume which part goes where on the 3D model, but in order to find that out, here's a little hint on how to do it. Now, I already know which part it is since I've had this before on other cars, but what you can do is simply paint a different color on the patches that you suspect to be the ones that you're looking for and resave with a color on top. And as we can see back in the iRacing Paint menu, there is now a paint stroke on the inside part of the hood. So I'll head back to my document and make a selection using the lasso tool all around the single UV patch and just paint over it. This is actually one of the reasons why I'm always using the brush tool instead of the bucket fill. Another thing that helps tremendously in finding the right UV patch on the car is to turn on some of the pre-designed color schemes, if there is any. As we can see in the scheme, the mirrors are the only thing that's painted red, so when returning to the document, we can see that there are somewhat mirror-like shaped elements in there that are painted red. This way I can easily make a selection using the lasso tool and paint my mirrors the way I'd like. And of course, I'm doing that on a new layer as well. Now, we're finally heading over to the spec map so we can judge the paint job a little better. And since we're creating a separate file for this, I'm gonna create a new layer right on top, calling this spec base, and also put this in a new group, which I'm gonna call spec. This way I can always separate my paint job from my spec map. The one thing I did wrong here was not to put it below the turn off folder, but that doesn't actually matter. We're only not gonna see the mask later on. Understanding the way of how to draw spec maps is actually pretty straightforward. In the color menu, you have three values: red, green, and blue. The red value determines how metallic the surface is going to be, where 0 means that it is fully non-metallic and 255 is fully metallic. If you have this value at 0, all the reflections of the car are going to be more like clear coat reflecting their original colors, basically like a mirror does. The higher you go on this value, the more the reflections are going to use the surface color, the car's color basically. This will make them appear to be much stronger and more saturated, but exceeding 200 is going to look more and more unnatural. The green value describes how matte the overall reflections themselves are going to be. Having it at 0 makes the reflections like really sharp, which is also the default value. The higher the value goes, the more satinized the surface looks. I wouldn't recommend to go any higher than 150 because it's already going to be velvet at that value and it looks really weird from that point on. And finally, blue is driving the glossiness of the surface, which basically softens the specular highlights, but not the actual reflections of the car. I pretty much never leave this value at 0, and I rarely go any higher than 125, depending on how matte I like the reflections to be. Okay, enough about the theory, let's just jump right into it. So I want the green base color to be a lot more matte with some really soft highlights, and I don't want to overdo it right from the get-go and choose a little lower value to see how much of a glossy matte surface we get. So let's try something around 50 for the matte value and maybe 30-ish for the glossiness. In order to save the spec map the right way, you have to call it car_spec_your ID. Make sure not to overwrite your color map by accident, otherwise your car is going to look a little wonky. Also, don't forget to save your main document in between, so you can always make changes later on and you don't risk losing progress. Pro tip. Saving the file and jumping back into iRacing, we don't really see that much of a change. The highlights are maybe a little bit softer, but we're not quite there yet. So let's jump back quickly and just increase the glossiness to about 90. I'm using this value quite a lot, so I already know what we're about to get. So, saving the file again, getting back in iRacing, and boom! Now, that's some beautiful looking matte highlights, right? Since we're rolling so well, let's jump right back and add another material. This time I'm gonna get to my bright green layer, and I'll get up here to select and click on Select from Layer. This way all of my layer's content is selected. You can also do that by control clicking on the layer's thumbnail. And now guess what? With the selection still active, I'm gonna create a new layer again in my spec folder. I want this material to be fairly metallic and slightly glossy this time. So I'll bump up the red value and just give it a little bit more in the blue range so we have a slight gloss later on. And since this isn't looking all that spectacular in the iRacing paint menu, here's a little bonus tip how to check your car's livery directly on track. You simply have to load up a test session and start driving for a bit. After leaving the pits, you can exit the car again, so you're back in replay mode. Once you're in there, you can pause the replay and hit Ctrl F12 to bring up the camera menu. From there, I mostly pick the chase camera and position it so that I can see the livery best. While iRacing is still running, you can actually jump back into your image editor and make changes to your maps. Once you're done, you can simply hit Ctrl R. This will then reload all the car textures in the running session. Especially highly metallic materials are always going to look pretty dull in the iRacing paint menu, but I actually check all of my cars in a running test session so I can see how they're looking inside of the game. You don't necessarily have to leave the pits, but I prefer to drive the car around a little so I get a chance to see the sun's reflections from multiple angles as well as how it looks while it's in shade. In the sped up footage you can see how I'm just following along this workflow, adding multiple elements in the paint folder and then constantly resaving each of the files over and over again to be able to judge my work on the car's livery better. Switching between all these layers can be quite a bit tedious for sure, but once you get the hang of it, it gets easier for every single car that you're painting on. You can also add images like logos or even photos if you want to create something unique. One thing to look out for is to make sure that logos and such need to be flipped, both vertical and horizontal when being placed on the right hand side of the car, so they're not mirrored later on. It certainly helps to play around with all the different UV patches so you know which part goes where on the car, and once you've finished your first livery, you'll notice that all of the layouts are in fact very similar. Also, sending your car into a live session and reloading textures is definitely really helpful to judge your work in the image editor. Alright, that covered most of the things you need to know in order to create your very own liveries. In case you have any questions regarding Photoshop, Affinity Photo, or the workflow in general, or whatever it might be, just drop me a comment and I'll try to help you out. As always guys, thanks a lot for watching, and especially thank you so much for surpassing 300 subs already. You're awesome guys, I don't know what to say. Next up, I'm gonna be at the 2024 Simracing Expo in Dortmund, and I'm definitely gonna cover my experience in a new video soon. So stay tuned, consider subscribing and liking the video if you want to see more, and take care, and I'll see you soon.